Throughout the years, we saw many changes to the battle mechanics of Pokemon. It seems like every single generation adds some sort of change or twist that drastically changes the way we play. In this series, we will take a look at each generation starting with Generation 1 and discuss what the competitive metagame was like, as well as what changes were implemented since that generation. I am your host PaPaSea, and if you want to see more videos like this, make sure you show your support by clicking that like button. Generation 1 was where it all began. We had a pretty small pool of Pokemon, as there were only 151 Pokemon at the time, and the OU tier was comprised of only 15 Pokemon. Now, these might not be the 15 Pokemon you exactly expect out of Generation 1, as you see Pokemon such as Lapras, Exeggutor, and Jinx, which really aren't used very much today and haven't been used pretty much since Generation 1. And you may also notice the omission of some prominent Generation 1 Pokemon today, like Dragonite and Gyarados, as well as Mew and Mewtwo, but Mew and Mewtwo were banned to Ubers in this generation. This was because Gen 1 battling was vastly different than it was today, as there were no held items, no abilities, there was no Steel, Dark, or Fairy type, special attack and special defense were combined and considered one stat, attacks were considered physical or special based on what type they were, and I'll put a chart on the screen that shows you which type was physical, which type was special. Critical hits were calculated by speed, which was one of the most broken things about Generation 1. There were no entry hazards such as spikes or stealth rocks, EVs and IVs were basically non-existent, and there were many other smaller changes in this generation. Psychic and normal types ran rampant in Generation 1. They are arguably the best types of Generation 1. This was because Psychic types were only weak to Bug, and the strongest Bug type move at the time was Beedrill's signature move Twin Needle, which was only a 25 base power move that could hit twice. This meant that if you really wanted to run Bug coverage hit those Psychic types, you're not going to do very much damage because you have like a base 20 power move. Psychic types were also immune to Ghost this generation for some reason, probably a glitch because Gen 1 is full of those, and the only type that resisted Psychic was Psychic. It's also worth mentioning that since Special Attack and Special Defense were combined to one stat just called Special, this really helps Psychic types defensively and offensively since all Psychic types had a high Special pretty much. This allowed them to take hits better and dish out hits even better. Thankfully, there were no hidden powers in this generation, which is nice because that means your Psychic types won't have insane coverage options. Can you imagine if you had like an Alakazam with an extra coverage and you want to have like a grass move or something? That would be a little bit too much. Normal type is a similar situation as Psychic, as its only weakness in this generation is fighting, which is still true today, which was very uncommon since Psychic types were so good and had such a huge advantage against fighting types, and there was not a single fighting type in the OU tier. Normal type Pokemon also had pretty ridiculous move pools, which was why Tauros was one of the best, if not the best Pokemon in Generation 1 OU. Tauros had base 110 speed, making it one of the fastest Pokemon in the entire generation. Critical hits were also calculated based on a Pokemon's speed stat, like I mentioned before, meaning that the faster your Pokemon is, the more likely you are to get a critical hit. Critical hits also did 2 times damage in Generation 1 as opposed to the 1.5 damage increase they do in Generation 6 and 7, which made them even more of an issue. Tauros could also use the move Hyper Beam, which was a physical move at the time, and the way Hyper Beam worked in Generation 1 was if you got a KO, you did not have to use your recharge move. This meant that you could just endlessly go for Hyper Beams, and as long as you get KOs, you will never have to recharge. This is pretty much the sole reason why Golem and Rhydon were OU at the time, because they were able to resist Tauros' normal moves such as Hyper Beam, as well as being immune to electric-type Pokemon such as Jolteon and Zapdos, which were prominent in this generation. Jolteon was the fastest Pokemon in the OU tier, meaning that it would get a lot of critical hits, so it was important to have a Pokemon that was capable of stopping. Rock and Ground were also physical in this generation, meaning you could hit Pokemon like Alakazam and Chansey a lot easier as their defenses are a lot lower than their special. You might be surprised to see that Dragonite, the only fully evolved Dragon-type Pokemon in this generation, is not in OU. This was because in this generation, Dragon didn't get nearly as much love as it got in Generation 3 and 4 and 5. There's no Dragon Dance, no Dragon Claw, no Outrage, no Draco Meteor. Dragonite is also weak to rock types, which does hinder it a little bit just because of the prominence of Golem, which is kind of funny to see how Golem is so prominent just to counter another Pokemon, and in that process, another Pokemon that is Dragonite becomes even less useful. The only Dragon type move at this time too was Dragon Rage, which only did 40 damage and had virtually no viability. Dragonite also had no usable flying type moves this generation, as 2-turn moves such as Fly and Dig were banned in this generation since they can cause a glitch. That's definitely a very prominent thing about this generation, is the sheer amount of glitches. It almost seems like they just didn't beta test the game and kind of just released this game with all these glitches. I mean, obviously it worked out for them because here we are 20 years later still talking about Pokemon and still playing Pokemon, but it would have been nice if they could have just, fix these small things. One of the most redeeming factors about Dragonite, however, is its access to the moves Wrap and Agility. Wrap was pretty broken this generation, as your opponent couldn't go for any moves while they were wrapped, and once the wrap turns ended, your opponent wouldn't get a chance to move. They would just be prompted with a message saying the wrap is over. This meant that so long as you were faster, if you click Agility for example, you can just perpetually click wrap and your opponent will never be able to go for a move until they This was clearly broken, which is why wrap was changed in later generations and why wrap is virtually unviable today. Freeze was also pretty broken this generation, as the only way to get thawed out was to get hit by a fire type move, which if your opponent had any brain cells, they wouldn't go for a fire type move if they knew you were frozen. Blizzard was also 90 accuracy in this generation as opposed to the current 70 that it is now, meaning you could just spam Blizzard with pretty little risk of missing. Sleep also worked pretty differently in this generation, since when you woke up, similar to Wrap, you couldn't go for a move, you just prompted with a message saying that your Pokemon woke up. Sleep also lasted anywhere from 1 to 7 turns this generation, and that counter would reset if you switch out the Pokemon, unlike today. Sleep was even more broken in Generation 1 than it was today, although today you do have easier methods of putting Pokemon to sleep, as back then the move Spore was exclusive to Parasect and Hypnosis is just only 60 accuracy. Paralysis was also pretty broken this generation, as it lowered the target speed stat by 75% and they had a 25% chance of doing nothing. It was a pretty common strategy in Generation 1 to go for a paralyzing move and then go for a move like Wraps, that way your opponent could never go for a move. And although Paralysis has seen some slight nerfs in the past couple of generations, I still think it's a little bit too strong. Accuracy also worked very different than it works today, thanks to, again, a glitch. Every single move in this game, for whatever reason due to this glitch, was not 100% accuracy and they had a small chance to miss. This was extremely frustrating, as you can go for a move that you think is 100% accuracy, like an Earthquake, and then miss. There were a few other minor differences Generation 1 had, like accuracy and base power changes to certain moves and such like that, and a few Pokemon having slightly different stats. But for the most part, these are the biggest changes that Generation 1 battling had from generations today. Now let's take a look at some of the biggest threats in Generation 1 competitive. Now it's important to realize that back in Generation 1, it was only single battles, there was no double battles, and there really wasn't any big official tournaments like there are today. So of course, we'll be focusing on a singles 6v6 metagame. First up is Tauros, which we did mention before, as Tauros is arguably the best Generation 1 Pokemon, having that fantastic normal typing, as well as that amazing Generation 1 move pool with moves such as Blizzard, Thunder, and Fire Blast. Tauros had 70 special this generation, which isn't that high, but it made it a pretty big threat on the physical and special side due to the move pool that it had. Tauros was arguably the best Pokemon in the OU tier at this generation, and it's a shame that it has fallen from grace so far and went all the way down to PU in Generation 7. It's seen little to no use in VGC since then, and it's really a shame to see that a Pokemon of this statue that was so revered in Generation 1 has fallen so far. And I really hope that in the future Tauros can just get better. Exeggutor was another big threat, as Exeggutor had that fantastic psychic typing in Generation 1, as well as Sleep Powder and Stun Sports who have access to status moves. Besides Solar Beam, Mega Drain was its strongest grass type attack, which also helped it heal a little bit of damage, as there were no held items, which meant no citrus berries and no leftovers. Exeggutor has a fantastic special stat of 125, as well as 95 HP and 85 defense, making it a nice bulky Pokemon. It did only have 55 speed, however, meaning you wouldn't get many critical hits, but since it did have that grass typing, it was a great Pokemon to counter those Rhydons. Zapdos was the only legendary Pokemon in the OU tier at the time, as Mew and Mewtwo were Ubers and Moltres and Articuno were UU, but Zapdos was still a huge threat. Zapdos has very similar bulk to Exeggutor, except more speed and access to moves like Agility to boost its speed even more. Zapdos was a pretty good mix attacker this generation as well. Its move pool was relatively shallow, but you did have some pretty strong stab moves in Drill Peck and Thunderbolt, which did help you out a lot offensively. Golem was also another great Pokemon to use in this generation, as Golem was a pretty nice counter to Zapdos and Jolteon. Golem had 110 attack as well as 130 defense, which gave it some pretty nice physical bulk to handle Pokemon like Snorlax and Tauros, and had access to 2 great stab moves in Rock Slide and Earthquake, which was pretty uncommon to see dual type Pokemon have 2 great stab moves like this. You also have access to Submission, which is the strongest fighting type move of this generation. It is a pretty bad move, it's an 80 base power move with 80 accuracy and 1/4 recoil, but if you really wanted a fighting move, Golem was one of your better options to carry a fighting move, since fighting types just got absolutely destroyed by psychic types. It also got Explosion this generation, which is pretty cool because it was 170 base power, and at the time, it halved your opponent's defensive stats, meaning that your Explosion would do a lot of damage to pretty much anything in the game. This made Golem a pretty big threat and a great suicide Pokemon, as not many Pokemon could live those explosions. Gengar was another big threat, as Gengar was the only fully evolved Ghost type Pokemon in this generation, which also had a pretty high special stat as well as a good speed stat. Gengar also had access to Hypnosis as well as some pretty good coverage for Generation 1, which made it even a bigger threat offensively. Its low HP stat and low physical defense did make it vulnerable to physical attackers like Tauros and Golem, as I mentioned earlier, but luckily it was immune to normal type moves, which did help it a bit. And that is pretty much Generation 1 in a nutshell. There is a ton to cover in this video, and I hope you guys enjoyed this. Let me know what you think in the comments down below, and if you want to see Generation 2, let me know and I will definitely do that in the future. Thank you guys so much for watching, have a good rest of your day, I will see you guys next time, and bye bye.